Have you ever wondered if animals can sense things about people that we humans cannot? What if the pet you love and trust was desperately trying to warn you about something or someone in your life? Prepare yourself for a deeply moving story about loyalty, instinct, and a dog's determination to protect the person they love most, even when no one believes them. This is a story that will make you question whether the bonds we form with our animals run deeper than we could ever imagine. In the picturesque coastal town of Newport, Rhode Island, preparations for what promised to be the wedding of the year were in full swing. Olivia Bennett, daughter of a respected local judge, was set to marry Richard Caldwell, a charming and successful investment banker who had swept into town just 18 months earlier. Their whirlwind romance had captivated the tight-knit community, with many remarking on how the previously cautious and reserved Olivia had blossomed under Richard's attentions. At 32, Olivia had almost given up on finding love. Her career as a marine biologist kept her busy, and past relationships had fizzled out as potential partners struggled to understand her dedication to her work and the irregular hours it demanded. When she literally bumped into Richard at a charity gala her father had insisted she attend, spilling champagne down his custom-tailored suit, she had been mortified. But Richard had only laughed, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that immediately set her at ease. Their courtship had been a dream: romantic dinners, thoughtful gifts, and Richard's apparent interest in every aspect of Olivia's life and work. Within 6 months, he had proposed on the cliffside path where they often walked, presenting her with an antique diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Olivia had said yes without hesitation, certain she had found someone who truly saw and valued her for exactly who she was. The only dissonant note in this perfect symphony of love came from an unexpected source: Max, Olivia's 5-year-old border collie mix. From the moment Richard entered their lives, Max's behavior toward him had been strangely hostile. The normally friendly and well-mannered dog would growl softly whenever Richard approached, his hackles rising despite Olivia's gentle reproaches. She had attributed it to jealousy at first. Max had been her constant companion since she'd rescued him as a puppy from the local shelter. Max had been a stabilizing force in Olivia's life through career challenges, family tensions, and the occasional bouts of loneliness that came with being single in a town where most of her peers were already married with children. The intelligent dog accompanied her on research excursions, waited patiently outside her university office, and seemed to sense her moods with an almost uncanny precision, bringing a toy when she needed distraction or simply resting his head on her lap when she needed comfort. Richard, to his credit, had tried to win Max over. He brought premium treats, offered to take the dog on walks, and never complained about the black and white fur that inevitably ended up on his expensive clothes. "He'll come around," Richard would say with a good-natured smile whenever Max retreated to the far corner of the room in his presence. "Dogs can be territorial. He's just not used to sharing you yet." Olivia had been touched by his patience, seeing it as further evidence of Richard's kindness and understanding. As the wedding date approached, however, Max's behavior toward Richard deteriorated rather than improved. The growling escalated to occasional barking, and he would position himself between Olivia and Richard whenever possible, as if trying to create a protective barrier. During one dinner at Olivia's cottage, Max had actually nipped at Richard's hand when he reached across the table to touch Olivia's arm, an unprecedented act of aggression that had left Olivia shocked and embarrassed. "I think Max might need to stay with your parents during the honeymoon," Richard had suggested reasonably after the incident, holding a napkin to the small red mark on his hand. "And maybe when we get back, we should consider some professional training." Though the words had been spoken gently, something in Olivia had recoiled at the thought of being separated from her dog. Still, she had nodded in agreement, telling herself that Richard's suggestion made perfect sense. Olivia's best friend and maid of honor, Sophia Martinez, had been the first to voice what Olivia had been trying to ignore. "Don't you think it's weird that Max, who loves literally everyone, has such a problem with Richard?" she had asked during a final fitting for Olivia's wedding dress. When Olivia had brushed off the comment, Sophia had persisted. "Animals have instincts, Liv. Sometimes they see things we don't." But Olivia had dismissed her friend's concerns as pre-wedding jitters by proxy. 1 week before the wedding, Richard moved the last of his belongings into Olivia's cottage, where they would live until they found a larger home. The plan was for him to stay there while Olivia spent the final pre-wedding nights at her parents' house, following tradition. As Olivia packed an overnight bag, Max had become increasingly agitated, circling and whining in a way that tugged at her heart. "It's just a few days, buddy," she had whispered, kneeling to ruffle his fur. "And then we'll all be together." Richard had insisted on keeping Max at the cottage rather than having him join Olivia at her parents' house. "You'll be so busy with last-minute wedding details," he had reasoned. "I don't mind taking care of him. It'll give us a chance to bond." Though Olivia had felt a flutter of unease at leaving Max behind, she had agreed, hoping that perhaps Richard was right. Perhaps this time alone together would help her beloved dog finally accept the man she was about to marry. The night before Olivia was due to leave Max with Richard, she had a vivid nightmare that woke her in a cold sweat. In the dream, Max had been trying to tell her something urgent, barking and pulling at her wedding dress, while a faceless groom waited at an altar that somehow transformed into a cage. She had dismissed it as wedding anxiety, but the unease lingered as she dropped Max off the next morning, his reluctance to let go of her making the parting more difficult than she had anticipated. For 2 days, Olivia went through the motions of final wedding preparations, trying to ignore the strange emptiness she felt without Max's reassuring presence. Several times, she had picked up her phone to call Richard and check on her dog, only to set it down again, not wanting to seem obsessive or untrusting. "He's fine," she told herself firmly as she sat through a final meeting with the wedding planner. "Richard loves me, and by extension, he'll take good care of Max." On the morning of the wedding rehearsal, Olivia realized she had left her grandmother's pearl earrings, her something old, at the cottage. With hours to spare before she needed to be at the church, she decided to retrieve them herself rather than bothering Richard, who had mentioned having a final fitting for his tuxedo. The familiar drive to her own home felt oddly tense, a sensation she attributed to the strange experience of approaching her cottage as a visitor rather than a resident. As Olivia's key turned in the lock, she was surprised by the silence that greeted her. Usually, Max would come bounding to the door at the sound of her arrival, tail wagging and body wiggling with excitement. "Max?" she called softly, stepping into the entryway and setting her purse on the small table by the door. The cottage felt eerily quiet, none of the usual clicking of Max's nails on the hardwood floors or his gentle huffing breaths. Thinking that perhaps Richard had taken Max for a walk, Olivia headed toward her bedroom to retrieve the pearl earrings. As she passed the home office that she and Richard now shared, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light visible through the crack. Pushing it open, she was surprised to find Richard sitting at her desk, his back to her, intently focused on her laptop screen. "Richard," she said, startled to find him home. "I thought you had a tuxedo fitting." Richard whirled around, his expression momentarily alarmed before smoothing into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Olivia, you scared me," he said, closing the laptop with a swift motion that struck her as oddly secretive. "The fitting was rescheduled. What are you doing here? I thought you were finalizing details with the florist." There was an edge to his voice that Olivia had never heard before, a tension that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were in the isolated cottage. "I forgot my grandmother's earrings," she explained, her eyes scanning the room for Max, unease growing as her dog remained absent. "Where's Max? Is he outside?" Richard's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, annoyance, concern, crossing his features before he replied with forced casualness. "He was being disruptive while I was working, so I put him in the storage shed for a little while. He's fine." A cold knot formed in Olivia's stomach at his words. The storage shed was a small windowless structure at the back of the property, used primarily for gardening equipment and seasonal decorations. It was dark, poorly ventilated, and certainly no place for a dog, especially one as active and intelligent as Max. "You put him in the shed?" she repeated, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "Richard, he hates confined spaces. You know that." Richard stood, moving toward her with the relaxed confidence that had initially attracted her to him, but which now felt somehow predatory. "Don't overreact, Liv. It's just for an hour or two." And he was being impossible, barking, scratching at the door while I was on an important call. I couldn't exactly have him interrupting a conversation with my biggest client. His tone was reasonable, even slightly wounded, as if she were the one being unreasonable. "I need to get him," Olivia said firmly, turning toward the back door that led to the garden, her grandmother's earrings forgotten. Richard caught her arm, his grip just tight enough to make her pause, his expression still pleasant, but his eyes cold. "We need to talk about Max, Olivia. After the wedding, we should consider finding him a more suitable home. My condo in the city doesn't allow pets, and with my travel schedule, it wouldn't be fair to keep him cooped up." Olivia stared at him, a cascade of realizations washing over her. This was the first she'd heard about moving to his city condo. They had always discussed staying in Newport, close to her work at the Marine Research Center. And Richard had always claimed to love Max, to understand how important he was to her. "Let go of my arm, Richard," she said quietly, a new steadiness in her voice that seemed to surprise him. "I'm getting my dog." His grip tightened momentarily, before he released her with a small laugh that didn't sound amused at all. "You're overreacting as usual. This is exactly why I worry about our future, Olivia. You prioritize that dog over everything, including me." He followed her to the back door, his footsteps too close behind her as she stepped out into the garden, heading for the small wooden shed near the property line. "We need to set some boundaries, Liv. After we're married, things need to change." The sound that greeted Olivia as she approached the shed tore at her heart. Max's frantic scratching at the door, accompanied by distressed whimpering that immediately escalated to desperate barking when he detected her presence. "It's okay, Max. I'm here," she called, quickening her pace. As she reached for the padlock, securing the shed, Richard stepped in front of her, key in hand. "Let me," he said smoothly, though there was tension in every line of his body. "He might rush out and we don't want him running off before the wedding." As he turned the key, Olivia noticed scratches on his hand and wrist that hadn't been there the previous day. Scratches consistent with a dog defending itself. Her blood ran cold at the implication, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The moment the door opened, Max burst out, not in the joyful reunion Olivia expected, but in a defensive stance, placing himself between her and Richard, his teeth bared in a warning snarl unlike anything she had ever seen from her gentle companion. Richard stepped back, his mask of affability slipping as he glared at the dog. "This is exactly the behavior I'm talking about, Olivia. He's becoming dangerous." Kneeling beside Max, Olivia ran her hands over him, checking for injuries while murmuring reassurances. The dog was trembling, his fur damp with what could only be fear sweat, his breathing rapid and shallow. When her fingers found a tender spot on his ribs that made him wince, something in Olivia hardened with resolve. "We're leaving," she said, standing to face Richard, one hand on Max's collar for mutual reassurance. "Max and I are going to my parents' house. Now." Richard's expression darkened, the charming facade crumbling completely. "Don't be ridiculous, Olivia. We're getting married tomorrow. All this fuss over a dog that frankly has behavioral issues." He reached for her, but Max interjected himself, the warning growl in his throat deepening to something primal and protective. For a tense moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of confrontation, the truth of Richard's character finally exposed in the afternoon sunlight. "Get in the house, Olivia," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave she had never heard before. "We're going to discuss this like adults, without that animal interfering." He took a step toward them, and Max's barking became frantic, his body vibrating with protective energy. Olivia felt a surge of clarity cut through her confusion and fear. Max wasn't just being difficult or jealous. He had been trying to warn her all along. "No, Richard," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt as she began backing away, Max moving in perfect synchrony with her. "I don't think we have anything left to discuss." She reached into her pocket for her car keys, her eyes never leaving Richard's face, which had transformed from the charming mask she knew to something cold and calculating. The man before her was a stranger, and the realization sent ice through her veins. Richard's laugh was hollow, devoid of the warmth that had once captivated her. "You're really choosing a dog over our future together, over everything we've built." He gestured expansively, encompassing the cottage, the garden, the life they had apparently been planning, though Olivia now recognized it had been his plan all along, not a shared vision. "Because the mutt doesn't like me." "Grow up, Olivia." "Max has never been wrong about people," Olivia said quietly, continuing her careful retreat toward the side gate that would lead to the driveway where her car was parked. "I should have trusted him from the beginning." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Max remained unusually silent now, pressed against her leg, his eyes fixed on Richard with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its assessment of threat. The shift in Richard's demeanor was sudden and chilling. The facade of reasonableness dropped completely, revealing a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into something predatory. "You think you can just walk away? A day before our wedding?" He closed the distance between them with alarming speed, causing Max to lunge forward with a warning bark. "After everything I've invested in this relationship?" The word invested struck Olivia like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she hadn't even fully articulated to herself. This wasn't about love. It had never been about love. Richard had targeted her for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was as a person. "My father's money," she said softly, the final piece clicking into place. "That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? The judge's daughter and her inheritance." A flash of surprise crossed Richard's face before his expression settled into something like grudging respect. "You're not as naive as you look," he acknowledged, his tone conversational even as his stance remained threatening. "Yes, your father's connections were appealing, but you weren't exactly a hardship, Olivia. Pretty, smart, easily manipulated." The casual cruelty of his assessment made her flinch. "We could still make this work, just get rid of the dog." Max's growl deepened at these words, as if he understood the threat they contained. Olivia's hand tightened on his collar, drawing strength from his solid presence. "That was never going to happen," she said, finally reaching the gate and fumbling with the latch behind her back. "And neither is this wedding." The gate swung open, and she stepped backward through it, Max moving with her in perfect coordination. Richard's expression hardened as he realized she was genuinely leaving. "This is a mistake, Olivia," he warned, following them through the gate but maintaining a cautious distance from Max's watchful presence. "Think about what you're throwing away. Think about what people will say when you jilt me at the altar. Your reputation in this town will be ruined." His voice took on a manipulative tone that she now recognized as his favorite tool. "Is that what you want? To be the crazy dog lady who couldn't commit?" The threat might have worked a day earlier, even an hour earlier, but standing in her own driveway with Max beside her, Olivia found herself remarkably unconcerned with Richard's opinion or anyone else's. "Goodbye, Richard," she said calmly, opening her car door and gesturing for Max to jump in, which he did immediately, positioning himself in the passenger seat with vigilant attention. "Don't be here when I come back for my things." As she slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, Richard approached the window, his expression shifting back to the charming mask she had fallen for, his voice taking on the gentle concern that had once seemed so genuine. "Liv, please, let's talk about this. You're upset and I understand why. I shouldn't have put Max in the shed. It was a mistake. We all make mistakes." The performance was flawless, but Olivia could now see the calculation behind the apparent sincerity. Her only response was to start the engine and back carefully down the driveway. In her rearview mirror, she watched Richard's pleading expression morph into cold rage as he realized his manipulation had failed. The transformation was so complete, so disturbing, that she pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to put distance between herself and the stranger she had almost married. Beside her, Max finally relaxed slightly, his vigilant posture easing as they turned onto the main road. The drive to her parents' house was a blur of conflicting emotions: relief, embarrassment, confusion, and a growing anger that burned away the last of her doubts. Pulling into the familiar driveway of her childhood home, Olivia sat for a moment, gathering her courage. How would she explain this to her parents, to the wedding guests, to everyone who had been swept up in the romance of it all? Max nudged her hand with his nose, his brown eyes full of understanding beyond human language. Judge Robert Bennett was in his study when Olivia entered the house, Max close at her heels. Her father looked up in surprise, removing his reading glasses as he took in her disheveled appearance and obvious distress. "Olivia, what's happened?" he asked, rising from his desk with the swift concern of a parent recognizing their child in crisis. When Max pressed protectively against her leg, the judge's gaze sharpened with understanding. "It's Richard, isn't it?" The compassion in her father's voice broke the last of Olivia's composure. "Max tried to tell me," she said, tears finally spilling over. "He knew all along, and I didn't listen." Between sobs, she recounted the events of the afternoon: the discovery of Max in the shed, Richard's cold fury when confronted, and the damning reference to her father's money. To her relief, Judge Bennett didn't question her judgment or suggest she was overreacting. He simply listened, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When she finished, her father was silent for a long moment, absently stroking Max's head, which the dog had placed trustingly on his knee. "I've known a few men like Richard in my years on the bench," he finally said, his judicial demeanor firmly in place. "Men who view relationships as transactions, who see other people as means to an end. I should have seen it." He looked at Max with newfound respect. "Unlike your dog, apparently." What followed was the most difficult phone call of Olivia's life. With her mother's arm around her shoulders and her father's steady presence across the room, she called Sophia to explain what had happened. Her friend's immediate response, "I'm coming over, and I'm bringing reinforcements," brought the first genuine smile to Olivia's face since the confrontation with Richard. Within an hour, Sophia arrived with two more of Olivia's closest friends, and surprisingly, her cousin Daniel, who worked as a private investigator in Boston. "I've been looking into Richard Caldwell for weeks," Daniel explained, spreading folders across the dining room table, while Max watched attentively from his place beside Olivia's chair. "Something about him felt off from the beginning, but I didn't have enough concrete evidence to come to you sooner." The contents of the folders confirmed Olivia's worst fears and revealed others she hadn't imagined. Richard had been married twice before, both times to wealthy women whose finances had mysteriously dwindled during their brief unions. The most disturbing discovery was a restraining order filed by his last wife, alleging emotional and financial abuse, as well as threats against her beloved cat that had mysteriously disappeared shortly after she filed for divorce. "He has a pattern," Daniel explained gently, as Olivia stared at the photographs of Richard's previous wives. Both blonde, both professional women in their early 30s, both with a striking resemblance to herself. "He targets independent women with assets or family wealth, isolates them from their support networks, and then systematically takes control." Canceling a wedding less than 24 hours before the ceremony created logistical chaos. But Judge Bennett handled it with the same decisive efficiency that had characterized his career on the bench. He personally called the most important guests, family members, close friends, colleagues who were traveling from out of town, while Olivia's mother and Sophia divided the remaining list between themselves. "Health emergency," was the agreed-upon explanation, vague enough to avoid immediate questions but serious enough to forestall argument. Throughout the long evening of phone calls and planning, Max remained glued to Olivia's side, as if still uncertain of her safety. His vigilance touched her deeply, reinforcing her determination to trust her instincts and his going forward. When they finally retired for the night, exhausted but resolute, Max took up position at the foot of her childhood bed, his alert ears swiveling at every sound from outside. "It's okay, buddy," Olivia whispered, reaching down to stroke his fur. "We're safe now, thanks to you." The expected confrontation with Richard came the following morning, ironically, on what should have been their wedding day. He arrived at the Bennett home unannounced, immaculately dressed and bearing a bouquet of Olivia's favorite flowers. Judge Bennett intercepted him at the door, flanked by Daniel and, unexpectedly, Officer Collins of the Newport Police Department, a longtime family friend who had taken a personal interest in the case after reviewing Richard's background check. From her position at the top of the stairs, hidden from view but able to hear everything, Olivia listened as Richard attempted to deploy his arsenal of manipulation, concerned confusion, righteous indignation, and finally barely veiled threats about embarrassment to the family and professional repercussions for Judge Bennett. Max, sensing her tension, pressed against her leg, his soft whine of concern covered by the increasingly heated exchange below. "Mr. Caldwell, if that is indeed your real name, I suggest you leave my property immediately." Judge Bennett's voice cut through Richard's rhetoric with judicial clarity. "The wedding has been cancelled, and my daughter has made it clear she wants no further contact with you. Officer Collins here has some questions about discrepancies in your background check, as well as some concerns about potential animal cruelty." The reference to Max seemed to ignite Richard's fury, his voice losing all pretense of civility. "This is about that damn dog, isn't it?" he snarled, loud enough for Olivia to hear clearly. "She's throwing away everything we built because her mutt doesn't like me. Is she insane?" The naked contempt in his voice confirmed every instinct Max had expressed from the beginning, every uneasy feeling Olivia had suppressed in her determination to see only the good in her fiancé. She found herself reaching for Max's collar, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. What happened next would be recounted at family gatherings for years to come. With a swiftness that belied his judicial demeanor, Judge Bennett stepped forward, his voice dropping to a register Olivia had heard only once before, when a defendant had threatened a witness in his courtroom. "That mutt showed more discernment and loyalty in one day than you have demonstrated in your entire miserable existence," he stated, each word precise as a gavel strike. "Now get off my property before I allow my daughter's dog to express his opinion of you more directly." Richard's departure was accompanied by threats of legal action that everyone present knew were empty. A man with his history of deception couldn't risk the scrutiny of a courtroom. As his car peeled away from the curb, Olivia finally descended the stairs, Max at her heels, to find her father looking simultaneously exhausted and triumphant. "I believe," Judge Bennett said thoughtfully, scratching Max behind the ears, "that we owe this gentleman a very expensive steak dinner." The aftermath was both easier and harder than Olivia had anticipated. Easier because almost everyone in her life rallied around her with support and understanding. Harder because explaining her near miss with Richard required confronting her own blindness to the warning signs. "I wanted so badly to believe in the fairy tale," she confessed to Sophia a week later, as they walked Max along the cliffside path where Richard had proposed. "I ignored everything that didn't fit the story I was telling myself." "We all have blind spots," Sophia replied, linking arms with her friend as Max ran ahead, joyfully chasing seagulls in the afternoon sunshine. "The important thing is that when it really mattered, you trusted your instincts and Max's." She grinned, watching the border collie's exuberant exploration of the shoreline below. "Though I have to say, I'm giving that dog final approval rights on any future boyfriends. His judgment is clearly superior to ours." The investigation into Richard Caldwell, whose real name turned out to be Jeffrey Reynolds, revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning more than a decade and multiple states. Officer Collins, working with authorities in Baltimore and Chicago, compiled enough evidence of fraud and identity theft to ensure that Richard would not be targeting vulnerable women for a very long time. When Olivia provided her statement to the police, she made sure that Max's role in uncovering the deception was prominently featured. Healing came gradually, in quiet moments, when Olivia found herself able to laugh again, to engage with her work without the shadow of shame darkening her enthusiasm. Max's unwavering companionship anchored her through the process, his simple joy in each day a reminder that the present moment was what mattered most. The bond between them, already strong before the Richard incident, as her family now referred to it, deepened into something approaching true partnership. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, Olivia was appointed to lead a new marine conservation project that would take her up and down the East Coast for the next year. Without hesitation, she outfitted her modest research vessel with accommodations for Max, including a custom life jacket and his own small deck space where he could safely enjoy the ocean air. Colleagues who initially questioned the wisdom of bringing a dog on such an expedition quickly recognized Max's value, not just as companionship for Olivia, but as a morale booster for the entire research team. 1 year to the day after what should have been her wedding, Olivia sat on the deck of her research vessel, watching the sunset paint the Atlantic horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. The past 12 months had been transformative, professionally fulfilling as her conservation work gained national recognition, and personally healing as she rediscovered her own strength and intuition. "You saved me, you know," she murmured to Max, scratching that special spot behind his ears that made his leg twitch in doggy bliss. "Not just from Richard, but from myself, from the version of me that was willing to ignore her own instincts." Max looked up at her with those soulful brown eyes that seemed to understand every word, his tail thumping softly against the deck in acknowledgement. Some bonds went beyond explanation, beyond human language, a truth Olivia had come to appreciate more deeply with each passing day. The research expedition had introduced her to new colleagues who respected her work and her boundaries, who found her story inspiring rather than pitiful. Among them was Dr. James Walker, a marine veterinarian whose gentle manner and genuine respect for all creatures had gradually earned both Olivia's trust and Max's enthusiastic approval. Unlike Richard's calculated charm, James's quiet authenticity revealed itself slowly, in small moments of kindness and integrity that Max recognized long before Olivia allowed herself to acknowledge their significance. The most important lesson from her near miss with Richard, one that Olivia carried into every aspect of her life, was the value of trusting the wordless wisdom that animals brought to human relationships. Max had seen through Richard's facade instantly, recognizing the predator beneath the polished exterior. His persistent warnings, which she had dismissed as jealousy or territoriality, had been his desperate attempt to protect the person he loved most in the world. Throughout human history, we have alternately venerated animals as spiritual messengers and dismissed them as creatures of pure instinct, devoid of the complex understanding that humans pride themselves on possessing. But in those twilight spaces between reason and intuition, animals often perceive truths that humans miss, sensing the dissonance between words and intentions, between surface presentation and deeper reality. In trusting Max, Olivia had reconnected with her own intuitive wisdom. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't romantic at all. They're about the unbreakable bond between a person and the beings who stand beside them through darkness and light, who offer protection without being asked, who see clearly when human vision is clouded by hope or fear or desire. Max had been more than a pet. He had been Olivia's guardian, her truth-teller, her most loyal advocate when she couldn't advocate for herself. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Olivia thought about how differently her life might have unfolded without Max's intervention. She might now be trapped in a controlling marriage, isolated from friends and family, her spirit and finances systematically drained by a man who saw her only as a means to an end. Instead, she was here, free, purposeful, surrounded by genuine connections, engaged in work that mattered to her. All because she had finally listened to the one being who had never lied to her. The next time you look into your pet's eyes and sense them trying to tell you something important, remember Olivia and Max. Consider the possibility that they see things you cannot, that their judgment, unclouded by social niceties or wishful thinking, might be clearer than your own. Our animal companions live in a world of authenticity, where actions speak louder than words, where character is revealed in small moments of unguarded truth. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying discovery is not what Olivia learned about Richard, but what she learned about herself, how willing she had been to silence her own misgivings, to override her instincts in pursuit of a relationship that promised completion but demanded compromise of her essential self. Max had saved her not just from Richard, but from the part of her that would have surrendered her autonomy for the illusion of perfect love. So listen to the dogs who bark at certain people for no apparent reason, the cats who refuse to enter specific rooms, the horses who balk at particular trails. They might be trying to tell you something vital, something beyond words, beyond human reason, but no less true for its wordlessness. In a world where deception is often polished to a high gloss, our animal companions remain steadfastly, gloriously honest. And sometimes that honesty might just save your life.